Everything began with Crimea, and everything will end with Crimea. These were the words stated by the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, on the 23rd of August last year. In making this statement, he was effectively saying two things. On the one hand, he was saying that Ukraine's current struggle against Russia really began nearly a decade ago, back in 2014, when the Russians initiated a much more limited invasion of Ukraine into the Crimean Peninsula, which they subsequently seized and annexed. And on the other hand, Zelensky was publicly announcing that his war goals in the current conflict included finally returning Crimea back to Ukrainian control. A goal that at the onset of the war appeared to be inconceivably optimistic. At the beginning of the invasion, most analysts expected Ukraine to collapse under the Russian boot in a matter of weeks or maybe months. The Russian army was generally considered to be the second most capable in the world after the United States, while Ukraine only possessed whatever outdated Soviet-era equipment the Russians had left behind in the country following the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Even resisting the Russian advance, let alone reclaiming Crimea, appeared to be a distant fantasy. But now, we're over a year into this war and far from falling apart. The Ukrainians have actually managed to push the Russians back nearly everywhere along the front line. By the end of 2022, the Ukrainians had rolled the Russians back in lightning counteroffensives in the north and the south, and even managed to liberate the city of Kherson, the only regional capital of any province in Ukraine that the Russians were ever able to take over since beginning their invasion. Now, with the military momentum on their side, fresh volumes of advanced Western military equipment entering into their inventories, and the revelation of Russia as being much more of a paper tiger than most people initially believed, the seemingly impossible goal of reclaiming Crimea a year ago suddenly appears a lot more feasible today. But could the Ukrainians actually manage to do it? And if they did, would it finally mean an end to the war? And what would happen to Russia and Putin's regime in the Kremlin? The answers to these questions are complex and uncertain, with a lot of potential variables to consider. Ukraine's ultimate stated objective at the moment is to reclaim all of their occupied lands from the Russians and restore their territorial integrity as it was prior to 2014. And that, of course, includes Crimea, where everything began. But taking back Crimea will inevitably be the most challenging, dangerous, and bloody objective for the Ukrainians to achieve. Because Crimea, for a plethora of reasons, is very different from all the other places within Ukraine's de jure borders that is currently under Russian occupation. And that should give the government in Kyiv a lot of pause for thought before they attempt to run into Crimea guns blazing. Let's begin with the basic realities of Crimea's geography, and how it inherently favors whomever is defending the peninsula against an external attack. You see, Crimea is very nearly a completely separate island, and that makes it very difficult to get anything or anyone into it. It is just barely physically connected to the European mainland by this extremely narrow isthmus called the Isthmus of Perekop. At its widest, this isthmus is only 5 kilometers across, and as the only physical entrance by land into Crimea, this isthmus has historically been the only possible path that an attacking army from Europe can use to march into Crimea through, without relying on boats or aircraft. This effectively transforms Perekop into a natural bottleneck, where armies advancing across it have no other choice but to tightly bunch up into dense columns in order to get across it, and where defenders can heavily concentrate their artillery and airstrikes in order to ensure maximum rates of destruction. Trenches, barbed wire, landmines, and fortifications built across the isthmus by whoever is defending Crimea will slow the attacker down and force them into costly frontal assaults on well-prepared positions. At the same time, they are also forced into the zone of concentrated incoming artillery and airstrikes. In short, the Isthmus of Perekop is the perfect location for a massive killing zone, and not one that would favor the Ukrainians attacking across it. And there's only so many ways that an attacking army can get across this kill zone in order to enter Crimea. Across the northeast of the peninsula is this large region known as the Sivash, otherwise known as the Putrid Sea. While it is covered with water, it's more like a series of extremely shallow lagoons rather than open ocean. The average water depth across the Sivash region is only between half a meter and 1 meter, and during low tides, a narrow window of opportunity is granted where attacking units from the Ukrainian mainland can advance across it and flank the defenses at the rear of the Isthmus of Perekop. But this strategy carries with it a heavy risk. Once the attackers advance across the Sivash and into Crimea during the low tide, the high tide will inevitably come back in again afterwards and fill the Sivash back up with higher water levels, temporarily severing the supply line between the units that are now in Crimea and their resupplies back over in the Ukrainian mainland. at least until the next low tide enables another crossing to take place. This provides another window of opportunity for the defenders on Crimea to counterattack and push the attackers back into the Savash where they can't be effectively resupplied. The only other methods available for an attacking force to break into Crimea are through either amphibious or airborne assaults on the hundreds of kilometers of Crimea's beaches. But airborne and amphibious assaults are difficult operations to pull off logistically even under the greatest of circumstances. And Ukraine will not have the greatest of circumstances. They simply don't have the amphibious landing craft or the helicopters and airplanes required to establish naval and air superiority over the Black Sea, while they'll also have to contend with the literal geographic fortress that is Sevastopol, the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Even though the Russians have suffered striking naval losses during this war, like the sinking of their flagship, the Moskva, the Russian naval presence in the Black Sea is still orders of magnitude greater than what the Ukrainians have. The Russians still have capable warships and submarines based out of Sevastopol, and air bases across the peninsula with more fighters than Ukraine has got. Not to even mention Russia's advanced surface-to-air missile systems bristling across the peninsula, like the S-400, that could probably shoot most of Ukraine's outdated Soviet-era fighters down. All of this effectively ensures that the Ukrainians will not be attacking into Crimea with either naval or air superiority. And that means that unless they acquire the necessary equipment from the West, any amphibious or air assault into the peninsula can be effectively ruled out by them. If the Ukrainians want to attack into Crimea, they're most likely going to have to attack the hard way, across the narrow isthmus of Perekop or through the swampy Savash. Crimea's geography essentially enables it to be transformed into a gigantic fortress that is very tough for anyone to crack into. And if history serves as any guide, the Ukrainians will be in for a brutal fight to take it. Just in recent-ish history, Crimea has been assaulted by an attacker on multiple occasions, and every time it's happened, there have been catastrophic casualties. In the 1850s, a combined force of French, British, and Ottoman troops, who greatly outnumbered the Russian defenders, attacked and besieged the port of Sevastopol. Both sides suffered over 100,000 casualties during that campaign. And this was with the French and the British possessing naval superiority in the Black Sea, which the Ukrainians of today will almost certainly not have. During the Russian Civil War a century ago in 1920, the pro-Tsar Whites controlled Crimea, while the Reds attacked it with 4 times greater manpower from the same direction Ukraine would most likely try today. By land, with frontal assaults across the isthmus of Perekop and a simultaneous surprise advance across the Savash that hit the Whites defending Perekop in the rear. Nonetheless, the Reds still suffered 5 times as many casualties in this kind of attack than the defending Whites did. And the only reason why the Reds were even successful was because of their vastly higher numbers and better ability to absorb losses. And then, in the Second World War, the Germans and Romanians attacked into Crimea in 1941, and it took them 8 months to break through and crack into the defenses at Sevastopol. So hard were the Crimean defenses to crack that they had to bring in the infamous Schwerer Gustav to help bombard the Soviet positions to rubble, the biggest mobile artillery piece ever built in the history of warfare. And they still suffered over 30,000 casualties to take it over. And then, finally in 1944, the Soviets attacked into German-occupied Crimea. That time, the Soviets had the advantage of being able to attack Crimea from 2 different fronts at the same time, across the isthmus of Perekop and through the Savash in the north, and a near-simultaneous amphibious assault from the Russian mainland across the narrow Strait of Kerch in the east, an advantage that the Ukrainians of today will inherently not possess. And further, the defenses and fortifications around Sevastopol still lay in ruins from the German attack on the city that happened just 2 years previously. Another advantage that the attacking Ukrainians today will not have. The Soviets attacked into Crimea with nearly twice as many troops as the Germans and Romanians had defending it, and they had significantly more tanks and artillery brought in as well. And nonetheless, the Soviets still took 85,000 casualties in only a month of combat liberating the peninsula, a ratio of nearly 1 in 5 of the Soviet soldiers who participated in the campaign. Based on these historical lessons, in order to overcome Crimea's geography favoring the defender, the attacking force in Crimea has always possessed either naval or air supremacy when attacking, and/or a significantly larger number of troops and equipment than the defenders have, in order to overcome what will inevitably become a lopsided casualty ratio. The most similar of the historical examples to today is the one during the Russian Civil War, when the Reds attacked into Crimea only over land across the isthmus of Perekop and through the Savash, without significant naval or air forces assisting them. They outnumbered the defending whites 4-1, and they suffered 5 times as many casualties in order to break through their defenses. If the Ukrainians manage to break through the Russian front lines and make it to the edge of Crimea today, they will likely face a force of at least 35,000 Russian troops defending the peninsula. Based on historic examples of the Russian Civil War and World War II then, the Ukrainians may want to consider attacking into Crimea with anywhere between a minimum of 70,000 and, more ideally, 140,000 troops when the time finally comes. And they can most likely expect tens of thousands of casualties, even if they end up emerging victorious. And that's assuming nothing at all goes wrong. This also isn't to say anything about the fact that, as of the production of this video, the Ukrainian army still has to actually make its way to Crimea first, before any of this can even be considered, and geography is also hindering their ability to do even that. Across October and November last year, the geography in the region was actually working to Ukraine's benefit. The Russians occupied the major city of Kherson over on the west bank of the Dnipro River, but the river separated the city from Russia's major supply centers that were over on the eastern side. The only ways the Russians could resupply their garrison in Kherson by land was over this road bridge, this rail bridge, or across this other road bridge up here running across a hydroelectric dam. The Ukrainians blew up the road and the rail bridge, and as their troops advanced closer to the dam, the Russians realized that Kherson was at a serious risk of becoming logistically checkmated. And so, they ordered their troops to surrender the city without a fight and retreat back across to the eastern side of the Dnipro River so that they could continue fighting another day. But now, if the Ukrainians want to punch through the Kherson region towards Crimea, they are going to have to be the ones to cross over the Dnipro River and attack the fortified Russian positions over on the other side of it, which will be very difficult for them to do. That's why instead, it appears that Ukraine's best way to get to Crimea will be to concentrate on attacking through the Zaporizhia and Donetsk provinces, across the flat and open steppes in the region, and then drive towards the coastline of the Sea of Azov, with the immediate objectives of liberating the cities of Melitopol, Berdyansk, and Mariupol. Doing this successfully won't just place their troops closer to Crimea, it'll also sever one of the primary supply arteries that the Russians are using to keep a hold over their position in Crimea, the so-called land bridge from the Russian mainland to Crimea through occupied Ukrainian territory. And then even further, if they manage to accomplish this, the Ukrainian troops will then be well poised to also attack west into the parts of the Kherson province still under occupation on the eastern side of the Dnipro River, without having to make a risky crossing over the Dnipro River itself from the west. Then, hypothetically fearing another encroaching encirclement again, the Russian troops along the Dnipro may then be forced to retreat even further back into Crimea, and only then can the Ukrainians contemplate their assault down into the peninsula. But this plan is also fraught with challenges and risks. The Russians also understand that this area is the most likely location for the Ukrainians to attack through next, and they are preparing for it by digging in and concentrating their new freshly recruited conscripts into the area to resist. In order to not suffer high rates of casualties by advancing across this open, flat front line towards Azov, the Ukrainians need more tanks and armored personnel carriers to punch through the Russian lines and drive across the steppe. Which is exactly why they've been pleading with the West for months now to send them exactly that. The United States has since agreed to send them 50 Bradley armored personnel carriers and 30 M1 Abrams main battle tanks for this purpose, while Germany and other European allies are sending them many more Leopard 2 tanks. Once the Ukrainians feel like they have the armor that is required for this offensive, they are going to launch it. But victory in war is never certain. If the Ukrainians fail to sever the land bridge during this offensive, they stand to permanently lose the southern chunk of their country for good, as the Russians are afforded more time to shove more freshly recruited troops and equipment into the area to beef up their defenses even further. But there's another major and almost hidden reason why the Ukrainians are nearly certain to try and attack along this front towards the Sea of Azov once they acquire the necessary armor coming in from the west. Ukraine understands that if they are successful here in severing Russia's land bridge, the next most obvious objective in Crimea does not favor them geographically during an attack. They could attack into Crimea, but as discussed before, they are likely to suffer tens of thousands of casualties by pushing on into it. So, rather than risking a bloody attack into the peninsula where the geography works against them, they could instead initiate a blockade of the peninsula where the geography works more in their favor and against the Russians. This is because just as difficult as it is to get attacking troops into Crimea, it's similarly difficult to get defending reinforcements and supplies into it as well. Right now, there's only 3 methods that the Russians can effectively use to get supplies into Crimea. The most efficient method is by using a lot of supply trucks from the Russian mainland through the occupied land bridge in Ukraine and into Crimea from the north. If Ukraine manages to sever the land bridge, that leaves the second most efficient option left for Moscow: lower volumes of road and rail cargoes moving in across the Kerch Strait Bridge from the Russian mainland. But the Ukrainians have already proven themselves capable of attacking this bridge and destroying sections of it. In October last year, a truck bomb blew up the road section of the bridge and made it unusable for trucks to continue carrying in supplies. That left the rail section of the bridge still operational, but the Ukrainians could still manage to destroy that as well. So if the Kerch Strait Bridge gets completely knocked offline, and the Ukrainians advance far enough to sever Russia's land bridge in the north, then Crimea gets de facto transformed back into an island again for the Russians, just like it was prior to 2018 when the Russians finished the construction of the Kerch Strait Bridge. All supplies coming into Crimea will then have to come in by the third and least efficient option: ferries by sea and aircraft by sky, both of which can be the targets of Ukrainian drones. You see, after the Russians seized and annexed Crimea back in 2014, this was how everything the Russians transported into Crimea had to come in. The Ukrainians didn't allow anything to move across their territory into another piece of their territory the Russians had just occupied, and the Kerch Strait Bridge didn't yet exist. And then to even further complicate Russia's hold over the peninsula, the Ukrainians dammed up and shut down the North Crimean Canal that delivered the overwhelming 85% of Crimea's water supply. This canal was built during the Soviet era and normally diverted vast supplies of water from the Dnipro River in the Kherson province down into Crimea, which is otherwise naturally an arid steppe without enough fresh water available to conduct large-scale agriculture in. After the Ukrainians shut down the canal, Crimea's whole water supply was essentially destroyed. And in just the 4 years between 2013 and 2017, the area of farmland under cultivation in the peninsula crashed by nearly 90%. And by 2021, immediately before the invasion, Crimea was suffering from widespread water shortages, and the Russian citizens there were only getting access to water supplies for 3 to 5 hours a day. Obviously, this situation was not sustainable for Russia's long-term hold over the peninsula, which is why they constructed the Kerch Strait Bridge in 2018 to help transport supplies in more efficiently than by only relying on ferries. But that bridge still wasn't enough. The water canal was still blocked, and a single 2-lane highway and rail bridge can only get so many things in for 2.5 million people's needs. Thus, increasing Moscow's sustainable hold over Crimea was one of the most primary motivators for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year. On the very first day of the invasion, the Russians secured control over the entirety of the North Crimean Canal, and then just 2 days later, they blew up the dam that the Ukrainians had built to obstruct the water flow down into Crimea. The North Crimean Canal is still currently entirely within the zone of control that Russia occupies, and the water has been flowing again down into the peninsula for the first time since 2014. But if the Ukrainians move back in and sever the land bridge, they can also re-block the Crimean Canal again as well, and deprive Crimea of its precious water supply. Then, with no water, no ability to conduct large-scale agriculture, and limited abilities to send supplies into Crimea, Russia's hold over the peninsula will begin to slowly wither away, and all the Ukrainians will have to do is simply wait for something to break. Moscow in general, and Putin in particular, are each terrified of losing Crimea because of how important the peninsula, and specifically the port of Sevastopol, is to both the national security of the Russian state and also to Putin's own personal political power. This is because Sevastopol Bay on the peninsula is without question the best natural harbor located anywhere on the Black Sea's coastline. And for Russia, it's probably at least their second best port location they currently control anywhere. This is because Sevastopol is both a warm water port, meaning it remains ice-free year-round, and also a deep water port, meaning that the water depth there is deep enough to enable large displacement warships and submarines to safely dock there. Further, Sevastopol Bay is located almost exactly in the dead center of the Black Sea, meaning that whoever controls the bay can use it to project power anywhere else in the Black Sea and dominate it. Russia's other major port in the Black Sea, Novorossiysk, can never compete with Sevastopol's advantages because the harbor there is smaller in size. It's shallower, there's a larger commercial port there that takes up a lot of the available space away from potential warships, and it's located on the Black Sea's eastern rim, rather than the dominating position in the center that Sevastopol offers. for hundreds of years. He who controls Sevastopol controls the Black Sea, and without it, Russia would not only lose their ability to maintain naval superiority in the Black Sea, they would also largely lose the ability to meaningfully project naval power through the Turkish Straits and into the Mediterranean, and from the Mediterranean into the Atlantic. This would effectively eliminate one of Russia's only major ways to project power into the world's oceans. The only other ways the geography grants the Russian state are in their ports in the Baltic, which are constrained by the fact that the Baltic Sea is largely a lake dominated on all of its sides by NATO or NATO soon-to-bes. Their port over at Vladivostok in the Far East, which is iced over for 4 months out of the year and stuck within the Sea of Japan, surrounded by major US allies like Japan and South Korea, and their only other really good port location in the far north of the Kola Peninsula at Murmansk, a warm water and deep water harbor that grants their northern fleet year-round unobstructed access into the Arctic Ocean. So if they lose control over Sevastopol, the Russian Black Sea fleet will be effectively doomed, and Russia's only remaining good harbor left will be Murmansk. In short, Russian naval power will take a massive and irrevocable L, and Russia's ability to influence world events nearby, like in Syria, the Middle East, and North Africa, will be permanently tarnished. From Russia's perspective, then, much of their calculus in this war goes into defending Crimea and keeping the peninsula stable in order for them to keep hanging on to the port at Sevastopol. Putin's own life might even depend on it. The 2014 annexation of Crimea and the construction of the road and rail bridge to it are all considered the crowning achievements of his long administration in the Kremlin. The independent Levada Center polling agency found as recently as 2021 that, the year before the invasion of Ukraine, an overwhelming majority of Russians, 86% of them, supported Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea. If Crimea falls back into the hands of Ukraine now, then what does Putin have to show the Russian people after paying hundreds of thousands of lives and untold amounts of treasure trying to cling onto it? This is all why, to Moscow and Putin, Crimea is of a vastly higher core strategic interest than it is to Washington or even Brussels. The Kremlin is inherently more willing to gamble and take risks with escalation over Crimea than Washington is, because it is simply more important to the Kremlin than it is to the White House. And this is where the risk of Russia's nuclear threats and red lines come into play when discussing any Ukrainian attack into Crimea. Because the peninsula is so geopolitically valuable to Russia, there is a risk, no matter how small, that if faced with losing it militarily to the Ukrainians, the Kremlin may decide it would be worth the risk and escalation to deploy a weapon of mass destruction in order to avert the outcome, either chemical weapons or a smaller yield tactical nuclear device. This risk is why the United States and Ukraine's other Western partners have so far declined to give them longer-range missiles or fighter jets that they could hypothetically use to help assist them in a campaign to take back Crimea. But obviously, even if Crimea isn't as important to Washington as it is to Moscow, it is certainly just as important to Kyiv, if not even more so. The peninsula served as the Russian army's most important staging ground leading up to the 2022 invasion. Moscow was able to concentrate tens of thousands of troops in a fortress immediately to the south of Ukraine's mainland, bristling with naval and air bases and support infrastructure. Moscow's control over Crimea is the most major factor in explaining why the Russian invasion in the south of Ukraine turned out to be much more successful and longer lasting than it was anywhere else. So long as Crimea remains under the control of the Kremlin, then, Ukraine's security will never feel secure. If this current war ends with Moscow still keeping Crimea and Putin still staying in power, there is always the risk from Kyiv's perspective that a few more years down the road, the Russians will just lick their wounds and recover, and then come back from Crimea again better prepared than they were in 2022. A peace with Russia retaining Crimea would be an uneasy peace for Ukraine, while a peace with Ukraine reclaiming Crimea would be catastrophic for Russia's aspirations at being a capable great power. And this is precisely why neither side, for the moment, is willing to negotiate on anything resembling a peace. The stakes are just too high, and neither side is yet exhausted fighting. But okay, let's say that just for the sake of the hypothetical, the Ukrainians actually do manage against all odds to attack into Crimea, take it back successfully, and avoid a Russian nuclear retaliation. What will end up happening next? This question gets us into the next part of what makes Crimea so completely different from all the other parts of Russian-occupied Ukraine that Kyiv has so far successfully taken back: Crimea's demographics. The uncomfortable truth is that right now, Crimea is a majority ethnically Russian area, and probably a very pro-Russian territory as well. Because you see, Crimea has a very long history of demographic manipulation coming in from Moscow. During the Second World War, Stalin ordered the deportation of hundreds of thousands of the peninsula's indigenous Tatar people, and hundreds of thousands of Russians moved in to replace them. Thus, Russians have been the ethnic majority in Crimea ever since 1944. Then, a decade after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine conducted an official census in 2001 that found that around 60% of Crimea's population were ethnic Russians, compared to only 24% Ukrainians and 10% Tatars. Because of this, Crimea was always the most pro-Russian part of Ukraine for decades before the 2014 annexation. In 1991, an overwhelming 94% of Crimean voters voted during a referendum to become their own autonomous republic within the Soviet Union, which would have separated them from the Ukrainian SSR. And then 3 years later, in 1994, another overwhelming 83% of Crimean voters supported allowing themselves dual Russian-Ukrainian citizenship. Crimea also consistently voted heavily in every Ukrainian presidential election for pro-Moscow candidates over pro-EU ones. But even though Crimean voters generally supported measures that would give their peninsula autonomy and closer relations with Russia, it didn't necessarily mean that they wanted to completely join Russia outright. This can be seen through votes like in December 1991. Wherein a slim majority of 54% of Crimeans voted for an independent Ukraine, albeit under the condition of Crimea's local autonomy from the government in Kiev. And then, in 2010, a local Crimean party running on a platform for unification with Russia received only 4% of the peninsula's vote. Although, to be fair, that election was held at the time when the very pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych was serving as Ukraine's president, and relations between Ukraine and Russia were very warm. But now, over the past 9 years since the Russians invaded and annexed Crimea, the demographic situation on the peninsula has only shifted further towards Moscow's favor. It's likely that tens of thousands of pro-Ukrainian Crimean residents have either left, been forcibly expelled, or arrested over the past 9 years. While at the same time, the Russian state encouraged the migration of anywhere between 500,000 and 1 million Russian citizens from the Russian mainland to the peninsula following the annexation. This demographic engineering in Crimea has almost certainly shifted the peninsula towards being even more pro-Russian than it had even been beforehand. Ultimately meaning that if Ukrainian troops come marching into Crimean cities, they may not necessarily be welcomed as liberators by everyone like they have been everywhere else. For the first time in this war, it might be the Ukrainian army that has to face a partisan resistance and a simmering insurgency against them. And so that begs what is perhaps the biggest question surrounding Crimea's future of all. If and when the Ukrainians retake Crimea, what will happen to all of these Russians on the peninsula who moved there since Moscow annexed it? Senior Ukrainian government officials have already promised amnesty from criminal prosecution for Crimean residents who collaborated with Russia. But that amnesty only applies to the residents of the peninsula who were there before the Russians annexed it in 2014. For the 500,000 to 1 million Russian citizens who have relocated to Crimea since 2014, they will most likely be afforded no such legal protections. In order to squash the resistance and the insurgency and return Crimea back to how it was before 2014, will the Ukrainians really forcefully deport up to 1 million people from the peninsula and push them all back into Russia? If they do, it will inevitably generate massive amounts of hardship and suffering for a lot of people that will be very visible, which will inevitably become a huge propaganda defeat for Ukraine and opportunity for Moscow that could encourage heavier resistance among the Russians in Crimea who are affected. Regardless of the ethics of Russia's conduct in occupying Crimea these past 9 years, the fact is that in order to change the reality back to what it was like prior to 2014, the Ukrainians will now have to forcefully deport at least hundreds of thousands of people, in the largest population transfer seen on the European continent since the Second World War. It's a bad choice that Russia has really given them no other option in choosing. Ultimately then, because of how costly in lives it will likely become for Ukraine to assault Crimea, the risks of Russia resorting to chemical or nuclear escalation, the likely partisan resistance on the peninsula, and the bad optics that will come with forcefully deporting up to 1 million people, it may just be a wiser decision for the Ukrainians to only make Russia fear losing Crimea than for them to actually try and take it. By advancing across Zaporizhia and Kherson, the Ukrainians can sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea and re-shut the Crimean Canal. And by combining that with blowing up the Kerch Strait Bridge for good, the Ukrainians can signal that Moscow's hold over Crimea is vulnerable, and then put the peninsula to siege. Then, fearful of losing the peninsula and the all-important base at Sevastopol, the Russians and Putin himself would likely be more heavily incentivized to enter into negotiations in order to spare themselves from losing Crimea. Rather than attacking into Crimea with all of the likely negatives, Ukraine can then enter into negotiations with Moscow with the upper hand, which as far as I can see, could lead to 3 possible scenarios. 1. Crimea returns to Ukraine diplomatically alongside the rest of Ukraine's occupied territories, which is difficult if not impossible for Putin and Russia's current government to agree to, and is therefore likely to encourage further escalation and fighting unless Putin is somehow removed from power and a more sympathetic government in the Kremlin replaces him. 2. Russia surrenders all of its occupied territories in Ukraine except for Crimea, which is difficult for Ukraine to agree to because of the associated security risks and the chance of Russia just coming back for another go at Ukraine in the future, and using Crimea again as a staging ground for that future attack. Or option 3. Russia surrenders all of its occupied land in Ukraine, and Crimea becomes an independent and demilitarized country separate from both Moscow and Kiev. UN peacekeepers are deployed to the peninsula to keep it out of both sides' control. Ukraine agrees to keep the water flowing through the Crimean Canal, and no military presence on the peninsula other than the UN peacekeepers is allowed whatsoever. Perhaps this independent Crimean state is still able to grant the Russians a lease to the naval facilities at Sevastopol so that the Black Sea Fleet can continue using it. But no other bases of any kind are permitted anywhere beyond it. That way, Ukraine gets its security dilemma mostly resolved by removing the Russian army and air force from Crimea, while their territorial integrity gets mostly restored at the same time, while Russia gets to maintain their Black Sea Fleet headquarters at Sevastopol, which is what they mostly want out of Crimea anyway. But ultimately, you and I should both be aware that there are never any easy answers or solutions to war. Wars begin in the first place due to a failure of diplomacy and a clash of core interests that cannot be reconciled. Ukraine and Russia alike face hard choices ahead of them, and there is no choice that will solve everything and keep everyone happy. Crimea's ultimate future, and the futures of the 2.5 million people who live there, for the moment, remains uncertain. As Zelensky said months ago, everything began with Crimea, and everything will eventually end with Crimea. Now, the macro objectives of nation-states have a vastly greater calculus that goes into them than the objectives and decisions of individuals. One of my biggest personal objectives for 2023 was to begin eating healthier home-cooked meals. And if that sounds like one of your goals too, then today's sponsor HelloFresh is here to help. Taking yourself to a grocery store and painstakingly searching for everything you need or want and then driving back home takes up a lot of time and effort. But HelloFresh greatly innovates on this inefficient model by shipping precisely what you want in the exact quantity you need directly to your front door. You just use their app or website to select one of 40 different meal options each week, including their limited-time festive fare collection, and then all of the ingredients show up directly on your doorstep in an insulated, ice-packed box. And you can even add on extra snacks, sides, and desserts as well. And once you get your box, you gotta go straight into cooking with all of the instructions provided on each meal's recipe card. And the cooking goes quicker than you'd expect since you don't have to deal with measuring it all and certain ingredients already come pre-prepared. That way, you can make a delicious, home-cooked meal in only around 30 minutes without spending any of your time shopping or meal planning. It's also cheaper than grocery shopping and 25% cheaper than takeout options. Personally, it really allows me to fit more delicious cooking into my busy schedule, and that means I can avoid ordering more expensive delivery food or eating unhealthy frozen meals. That's why I've been using HelloFresh myself now for over 2 years, and regularly order some of my all-time favorites like this amazing buffalo spiced chicken. All around, HelloFresh is just a better way to eat. And it's often cheaper too, especially since you can click the button that's here on your screen right now, or by following the link down in the description below, which will take you to HelloFresh.com, where you can use the code RealLifeLore60 to get 60% off plus free shipping. It's a great way to help support Real Life Lore and eat well too. So once again, that's HelloFresh.com and use code RealLifeLore60 for 60% off and free shipping. And as always, thank you so much for watching.